All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the AVA Movement Podcast. Today we are joined by New York Times bestselling author AJ Hartley. His catalog of work spans over 40 publications. He's a Shakespeare professor and baby metal fanatic. Alongside Tom DeLonge and To the Stars, he's written popular series such as Secret Machines and Cathedrals of Glass. His new novel, Trinity, is set for release on June 11th. AJ, welcome to the AVA Movement Podcast. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Let's kind of looking forward to this one in particular. It's pretty rare with social media these days that we actually get to meet each other out in the wild. So we've had the pleasure of enjoying a few pints at the pub. So I appreciate that, and really looking forward to some of the conversations that we have during this podcast. So.
Yeah. I was trying to think when that was. It was like a little over a year ago.
Yep. For a little bit, you're out for some conference or other. So yeah, appreciate it. Nice getting to know you. So a lot of fans know, but for some of these new fans, of course, we have a lot of you like fans these days. Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with To the Stars and just kind of like a quick summary of how you and Tom got connected? I assume, Tom comes up to you and says, "Hey, I have all this top secret information. I want to get that out. And guess what? I want you to write it." Just a typical Tuesday for you, right?
I mean, it actually, that's not far from the truth in some ways. And it's funny, we were texting back and forth, Tom and I, a few weeks ago, and I had, for some reason, I had to go back and check something in email, and I texted him, and I was like, "You realize we've been working together for in September, it'll be 10 years." And he was like, "What?" But it started 10 years ago. I had a bunch of work that was on submission, and it had been sort of quiet. I'd been working on some things which hadn't immediately landed, and they were out, and my agent called me and said, "I've been approached by this guy from Blink 182. Have you ever heard of them?" And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, I've heard of them." And she's like, "Well, he's looking to partner with somebody to work on this what became Secret Machines, though I don't think it was called that at the time." She said, "Do you want to be considered for the project?" And I said, literally at the time, I had nothing going on. Everything had been on, some stuff had been on submission for like a year in some cases. And so I was like, I'm literally between projects. I don't know what I'm going to do next. So I was like, plus I was just curious, It's like, so she's like, "Well, I'll send him some of your stuff, because I think they're looking at a few people and see." And, he obviously liked what he read of my stuff that had already been published. And we started having phone calls, meetings to sort of talk about how we might work together, what this thing was, what he wanted it to be, this thing that became the Secret Machines series. And along the way, he asked to see what became Cathedrals of Glass. Again, it had a different title at the time, which was one of the things that I'd had on submission for ages and wasn't going anywhere. And he immediately connected with it. I'd only written the first book. And he immediately liked that. And he's like, "Yeah, okay, I want 3 of those. And I want to do these 3 Secret Machines books." And then some of the other stuff, I think I've said this in other interviews, some of the other stuff that I had on submission also landed and turned into trilogies. So I went from having nothing under contract to having like 9 books under contract in a really, really short space of time, which was great, but sort of terrifying. And one of them was the Secret Machines thing. And even after talking a lot, I still didn't really know exactly what it was that Tom wanted to do. He's, super enthusiastic and smart, but the project sounded huge, And every time I tried to sort of nail down what the story was as he imagined it, it seemed to get bigger. And I would say, so, where is it set? And he's like, everywhere. And I'm like, okay. And I'm like, when is it set? And he's like, all periods. And I was like, okay, I don't know what this is exactly. And I knew the focus was going to be on UAPs, UFOs, and the phenomena surrounding all that stuff. And sort of an X-Files-y kind of vibe to it. But we didn't have a really tight focus at all because he wanted it to be super flexible and be able to include a lot of stuff. And then we sort of started brainstorming properly. He flew me out to California and we spent, I can't remember, a few days really sort of talking specifics about how the story would take shape, what he wanted to be included. And this was all really preliminary. And for me, I realized that what I needed to do was sort of nail down a kind of narrative architecture for the thing and to try and find ways to include all the stuff. You've heard me say some of this before. All the stuff that he wanted to talk about, to me, meant different narratives, different characters, different timelines, different places, and then find a way to sort of weave all those together. So for me, that was the way in. So anyway, that's the long rambling version of the answer. So that was the Secret Machines. And then we also did two. So we've done two of those and two Cathedrals of Glass books. Secret Machines is currently in development for television, which is a really long, slow process, which is one of the reasons that we haven't done book 3 yet. But, we're going to do it, but there are various sort of variables. And then the next thing is Trinity, as you mentioned, which is separate. And at least at the moment, it's a standalone. It's not supposed to be the beginning of a new series. And it's connected to the Secret Machines books. It's part of that kind of thematic worldview. But it is a separate narrative, separate story.
Yeah, we'll touch on that obviously a little bit, but that's super interesting to know, like, how you just get kind of that random phone call one day. So I guess I wasn't too far off.
It's funny because when we did start talking, and I think I've said to you before, I mean, I was a little old for Blink. Yeah. I mean, I was a big music head, but by the time Blink were hitting it, I was in that sort of phase where I was still listening to new music, but I wasn't a kid, Sure. Yeah. I was already teaching as a professor by then, and in many ways, I think that was really good because right from the start, it meant that I could talk to Tom as a creative partner rather than as a starstruck fan. You know what I mean? That if I had been really into Blink, I don't think it would have worked the same way. Because for a collaboration to work, you got to be able to sort of stand on your own 2 feet and argue for what you think you're there for. I mean, Tom wanted a writer to work with because he's not a writer. And so I think it was important for us to have a really good back and forth. And he's always been a super supportive, collaborative presence. Not always the case.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, well, the next question is like pros and cons of, writing for someone else essentially versus your own thoughts and ideas. You can kind of take them how you want. It's, I imagine, a little bit more freedom. But also, like, the pros of collaboration is those ideas that you probably wouldn't have otherwise had, right?
Yeah. I mean, if you are traditionally published, in other words, if you work with a big press, you're never completely by yourself. You're never completely in control because you're always going to be dealing with editors and cover artists and all that sort of stuff, who are working for the publisher and who are going to say, we think it needs to go in this direction. We think this is, we want you to rethink this. So it's always somewhat collaborative at the editorial stage. And I mean, I have friends who self-publish, and one of the things they like is that no one is having any impact on their stuff or making any input on their stuff except them. That's a double-edged sword, and sometimes you think, yeah, I can tell that nobody had any input, and that and maybe would have been better if they had,
Sure. Yeah.
So, it's good to have, it's always good to have people responding to your stuff and say, if nothing else, saying, this is what I'm getting. Is that what you want?
Yeah, makes sense.
But obviously working with Tom, he comes in with a lot of big picture ideas. He thinks very visually. So even if we're strictly talking about a book, and obviously when Secret Machines first came out, we were simply talking about a book. We weren't talking about TV shows and movies. He may have had them in the back of his head, but I think he thinks in those terms anyway. He has a very sort of cinematic imagination, so certain scenes immediately strike him for the sort of pictorial impression,
Sure.
So he comes in with stuff like that. He comes in with big conceptual stuff, and he comes in with certain kind of specific visuals. And part of my job is to then turn those things into a coherent narrative and to find, the stuff that I care about, which is mostly character stuff, writing people who I find compelling and interesting and relatable in certain respects. And using them to sort of thread through this sort of larger landscape of ideas and issues and so on,
Makes sense. Yeah. So kind of talk about the Trinity a little bit. That's the new one that's coming out June 11th. So what can you tell us about it? You touched on it a little bit, general tone of the book and kind of how it stands apart from the others. Like, is it in the same realm of Secret Machines and the fact that you had some kind of pieces that you're trying to get out to the public a little bit, or is this more strictly just a fictional kind of piece, would you say?
I mean, there are I'm the storyteller primarily, so my focus is always on the story. I think people to the stars, Tom included, are interested in. I mean, there's a reason that the title of the book is Trinity, and it's the name of a fictional town in Nevada, and the story's set in 1962 during a series of atomic tests, nuclear bomb tests, and the idea is that one of these tests brings something down. So, as I say, this is a strictly fictional narrative, but as a lot of people involved in sort of ufology and the phenomenon, larger conversation will say that these kind of things are growing out of events that they believe have actually happened, where nuclear tests have had impact on other things, and that the nuclear tests themselves have attracted attention from elsewhere. So I mean, so it's a self-contained story, and in this case, the core story idea, Tom worked with me in terms of developing in much more specific terms than usual. Usually he sort of throws me a few sort of general ideas and I run with it, including something that we're doing now. But in this case, he had a much more sort of polished idea as to exactly what he wanted the story to do. And it follows a group of sort of high school kids, in '62, and he wanted a real sort of American Graffiti type vibe. I don't know if you know that movie, with the sort of car culture and this sense of when he came to me to talk to me about it, he's like, I really want to sort of develop these characters and develop a sense of this particular moment in American history, this sense of being on the edge of the space race and the sort of all the shift at the end of the Second World War, this sort of movement away from an old world as America sort of took its place on the global stage and was looking forward to the sort of, Jetsons version of the future, where's my flying car, right? That sense of what, modernity might mean for America in terms of, and the car culture thing is part of it, right? The sort of, when you look at cars from the early 60s, the way that they look like spaceships, they've got all these like little lights on the tail fins and stuff like that. And this is all part of the culture of the day, this idea that they're sort of aggressively reaching for a future which was defined by space and by new technology and such. So, but we're simultaneously in this little rural town in the middle of nowhere, Nevada.
It kind of, like, the little bit I know about it, like just from reading some of the descriptions online and things like that, is it almost kind of reminds me of like Stand By Me, the movie, which is also based on a novel, kind of like a coming of age, but also kind of getting into some pretty serious stuff that they may not otherwise have been. But I feel like he kind of comes at that angle quite, like even Monsters of California was kind of similar. Like it's about being a kid, about growing up, but also kind of peppering in very real life adult situations.
Right, it's very Blink, right? It's very, Tom is really interested in and shaped by reflections on a kind of adolescence. And I mean, I write a lot of YA, and one of the things that has always fascinated me about YA is that whatever else the story is about, it's ultimately about people trying to figure out what kind of adults they're going to be. Shedding their childhood, dealing with the realities of the world, and positioning themselves as, whether they're as artists, as moral beings, as whatever they're going to be, and say, this is who I choose to be. I'm getting rid of all the stuff that I inherited from my parents and my community and my church or my whatever it is, and I'm making a decision about who I want to be. And that's at the heart of a lot of these kind of stories, Trinity included. And I always find that fascinating.
Yeah, that's a great correlation between that and Blake. I hadn't really thought about that before, but guys,
but you know what I mean, right?
Writing style are very similar to his music. Yeah, it's like kind of fun, but also if you listen to those lyrics, there's some pretty deep stuff in there that kids and teenagers have to grapple as they grow up. So, yeah, great point. So you kind of talked about a little bit too, like it feels like his involvement in the writing process is becoming a little more and more. Would you say that it's based on the topic itself, or more so he's just more comfortable with the thoughts now, and he's got a movie out, he's got a film, and he's got a couple collaborations with yourself under his belt, so maybe he's kind of taking a little more ownership as he gets more comfortable?
I don't know that it necessarily reflects a specific trajectory. I think it's project specific, because as I say, we're working on something now, which I'm probably not supposed to talk about, which is a new project. And that one has gone much more like the Secret Machines project, where I've had really wide freedom, and he sort of winds me up and sets me off, and then comes in when I have a first draft to sort of talk about things that he wants to see pushed up or or modified and such. So, the Trinity was different. And I think it was something that he had already been thinking about and talking to people, to other, collaborators at To the Stars about, and possibly viewing right from the outset as a possible movie project. And sort of therefore, and sketching out a very clear sense of the shape of the story, and even like who the characters were, and how the story would unfold. And I was not privy to all that in advance. I was. I only found out about it when he started sort of talking to me about actually writing the book. But yeah, he gave me a lot more for this. Then and basically said, expand it, make it feel real. And then there were other things that I developed and changed some. I changed some of the character stuff, and a few other, things along the way. But there was much more of the story in place. And partly also, unlike Secret Machines, which is a huge, sprawling, whatever it is, 600-700 page book, each one.
Whatever that is.
Doing all kinds of stuff. Right. This is much more like a conventional novel. I can't remember what it comes in at. It's maybe 90,000 words, something like that. And so, it's much more like a regular novel. So the story is comparatively simple. And instead of having lots of subplots and lots of sort of tangential things and parallel narratives, it's not doing that. It's a much more clear, straightforward. I'm really interested to see how people respond to it and how it performs, because I think some people probably find the sheer size of the Secret Machines books kind of daunting. And I've heard people say, there's too much going on. I found it hard to follow. I mean, okay, whatever. But nobody's going to say that about this.
Okay, cool, interesting. So you kind of mentioned about when you first met him, and it kind of use this rock star of it. Is it any like adjustment period since you kind of became immersed in like the Tom DeLonge fandom as a writer, like even this kind of stuff? And like, I know you're kind of on some of those fan pages, and you're very accessible to everyone, which is great. Did that kind of take a little bit like, oh wow, this is, I'm going to have to maybe approach things a little differently, rather than, before you're just kind of your own runner doing your own thing, to kind of get exposed to all these like questions. And I think in general, Tom's fans are a little unique in the sense that they're very passionate about anything he's trying to do and want to know like, what's it going to be? What's going to be? Was that kind of a adjustment period for you as a writer?
Yeah. I mean, for the most part, most writers are not celebrities, I mean, very, very few. And if you think about it, how many novelists would you recognize in the street? Not many. It's like saying how many screenwriters. You'd recognize all the actors who are mostly just saying stuff that somebody else told them to say, but you don't recognize any of the screenwriters.
Sure.
You wouldn't even know their names in most cases. I mean, the number of, and even as a novelist, the number of writers I would recognize in the streets probably pretty small, unless they were friends, people I already knew. But there are not many, because there might be a picture on the book or something. But when you're in a book, you're not thinking about the person who wrote it. Their face is not in your mind. Hopefully, you're in the story and in with the characters and so on. So, that kind of fame is not something that writers have. So on the rare occasions when somebody will recognize me, like without any kind of warning, it's because of Tom. And so there's a kind of weird. It's funny because people are like, oh wow, you're like a rock star yourself, and I'm like, yeah, except I'm really not, and I'm sort of tangential to Tom, and it's Tom's presence and Tom's history as a musician and Tom's charisma that people connect to, and I become a kind of and
Yeah.
and something that's sort of glommed on
Sure.
a peripheral part of him that So yeah, it's a very different kind of experience that has changed. As I say, we've been working together for 10 years, and it has changed my life as a writer. And we have a number of projects that are sort of in development at the moment, including Secret Machines, which, if any of these things actually become TV shows or movies or whatever, that's a massive leap for a writer. Most
Sure.
novelists never get anywhere near that,
Cool.
and so, I'm grateful to Tom because, without him, none of this would have happened. None of that would have worked. And I feel very fortunate that by chance, we were able to connect and have had a really good working relationship since. And, yeah, it's nice to get a call out at a Blink show or whatever,
Sure.
So, yeah, I mean, I think I said that I made a little video when he dedicated Aliens Exist to me on the Blink tour when they were in Charlotte, and it's like for a split second you're like, this is what it's like to be a rock star.
Yeah, that's me.
And then you go back to being just Joe Schmo, some schmuck that nobody's heard of.
Yeah, and I think even more so now. Like, I was gonna ask too. You've been together 10 years. I think that was prior to any of this Blink reunion and all that. So I think even more so now. Have you seen any changes as far as like once he went back to Blink, he's playing these 95,000 people shows, and even as like Angels and Airwaves fans, I think we all were kind of like, oh yeah, that's right, he is this like global massive rock star. But from what I could tell, he's pretty much the same guy, whether he's playing a 2,000 people show with Angels or a 90,000 show out in Brazil or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my impression. We haven't spent a lot of time together in person since he was on tour. I mean, I met him when they were playing locally. We went backstage and hung out for a while. But most of the time, my relationship with him is mostly sort of phone and text kind of thing, and occasionally we'll do like a video chat or whatever, but we're not sort of in the same space very much, partly because of his various sort of touring schedule at the moment and stuff that I'm doing as well. And the last time, I mean, I had him on my little YouTube channel, I can't remember, a couple of years ago in March, and we did a little recording, and we were just talking about, I can't even remember, we were just talking generally about art and creativity and how he writes songs and various things. And then after I turned off the camera, he's like, okay, so you need to know that I'm back in the studio with Blink and we're going on tour. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, but keep it, don't say anything.
Yeah.
And this was in like March, and I had to sit on that till it was announced in October. And I kept looking online, and I was like, surely this is going to leak. At some point, people are going to find out that this is happening. And it never did. There were a couple of little rumors here and there, but it never went anywhere. And then they they announced the tour, and the tickets sold out in no time, and they had to add dates and all that sort of stuff. So, a part of me, I didn't see that coming, and I didn't know what the sort of scale of it was going to be. I don't think they knew what the scale of it was going to be, until it actually happened. I
think a lot of the Two Stars fans and like there are some like hardcore Angels and Airwaves fans that much prefer that. So I think for some of those people, it's like, is this gonna totally derail? We'll never see Secret Machines end. And so I think we're all very happy that he's able to juggle both, and he's still making time for his other endeavors.
Yeah, I don't know how he manages it, to be honest, but I know for a fact. I mean, and you look at the tour schedule, and he's like, okay, I got a month and a half off here, and I've got this time off here and this time off here. And I know for a fact that he's using that time really constructively, and that a lot of balls are in the air. So yeah, yeah. I mean, I've no idea what his musical plans are as far as Angels are concerned, but I wouldn't assume that it's going to be all blank from here on.
Too much. Yeah,
Hmm.
for sure. So kind of getting back to you as a writer, one of the questions we have is like, what do you use for like inspiration while writing? Do you listen to certain music or watch films of maybe those genres, or is it maybe like reading other novels that might be in that same time frame? Or is there anything as a writer that you do to kind of immerse yourself in that environment?
Um, I mean, you have to be really careful with going back to, especially other books, that are related, because it's really easy for them to start to bleed into your own work in ways that is either limiting or makes yours sort of either derivative or reactive in some ways. Well, this such a buddy wrote it this way, so I really don't want to do that. So, but that might not have been the choice that I would have made if I didn't know that some of this stuff was already out there. So, most of the time, if it's about period or location, then I usually find other ways to do research. I mean, I did go back to rewatching American Graffiti and things like that, but it was the kind of thing where you watch it and then say, okay, I remember this, I get the feel of it, and then you sort of put it aside. And one of the things that Tom and I talked about with regard to Trinity was the way that a lot of the sort of nostalgia stuff, because of course American Graffiti didn't come out in the 60s, it came out later as a kind of retrospective. And often that is sentimental. It's shaped specifically by the period in which the thing was made, rather than the period which it's made about. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of inevitable, but it means that sometimes the history's sketchy, And I was, when we first, outlined a version of the story, and it's like, this was a story, it was all white people. And I remember talking to a black friend of mine, and he's like, this is a myth. The idea that there was this sort of exclusively white populations in these areas and there were no black people at all. It's like, it really wasn't like this. It's just that they have sort of been effaced from the official record. So, Tom and I was like, let's rethink this. Let's do a little bit more research into who these people were and how that changes the communities. So things like that, I think, and maybe that it again is an instance of us sort of thinking 21st century ideas, and then rewriting the history accordingly. But, there's a sense in which that's always the case when you're doing any kind of historical project. You're always writing for people in your own period, So it's like if I put on a Shakespeare production, the 21st century audience is in many ways more important than the Elizabethan audience, because that's who I'm talking to, So I'm not interested in doing a kind of theatrical archaeology. I'm not interested in teaching people about what was. I'm interested in using something from the past to connect to an audience in the present. And if it doesn't connect to them in the present, then I don't know why I'm doing it. So I think, a version of that is always true. So, I'll do a lot of research into the period and the locations and things. And if I can, I'll go to these places and sort of, because, no amount of Google searching is going to tell you what a place smells like,
Right.
So, I'll do that, but then I'm also deliberately keeping an eye on the world in which I live, because that, in the end, is who I'm writing for.
Yeah, makes sense. And then as far as like, if you already know, like you kind of mentioned Trinity might, or was like kind of likely to be either a movie or television, do you approach that writing differently, or is it just like, hey, I'm gonna write how I write, and then it's up to someone to take that and adapt it into a screenplay?
That's a really good question, and a tricky one to answer, because movie people have a very particular way of thinking about story, about how narrative develops, and pacing and perspective and character representation and such. And much of that is really good and useful outside film, but I'm really a stickler for the idea that books and movies are different, and that part of what a book gives you is a kind of inner life, or access to the inner life of the character, which is really quite different from watching them in a movie.
Sure.
So especially in a situation where Tom comes in with a lot of action ideas and visuals and such, then I'm gonna use all that. But then I think part of my job, and this comes back to that collaboration working best when you're coming from different places, rather than when you've got two people who are basically good at the same thing. But part of what I bring to the process, I think, is a sort of focus on language in terms of how the story gets told, and an interest in the kind of inner life of the characters and things like that. So I would say I take on board all the sort of dramatic visuals and things that Tom is already kind of thinking about for a book like Trinity, at least. And then I'm not pushing against that, but then I think my job is to then deepen the subtextual stuff. So I think it's quite different. And if this was to become a film, maybe some of what I'm doing wouldn't get the same. I don't know. I don't know. It would be different. I mean, I think books and movies are fundamentally different things. They communicate in different ways. People sometimes talk about a movie being true to the book. There's no such animal. There is no such animal. A book communicates. It's just the words on the page and you as a reader, and you're filling in all the blanks that are triggered by the words. It's not like a movie that tells you what to look at and how to feel and how the music works. Totally different. Every shot from a movie contains thousands of choices made by somebody else.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Speaking of screenplays, is that something you could see yourself dabbling in with To the Stars and those projects? I know like we had Stan Spry on a while back now. He mentioned there's like a dozen or so projects floating out there. Is without giving too much away, is that something that you've thought about or have been reached out to look into?
I don't know. I mean, I have worked on screenplays. I'm doing one on my novel Hideki Smith at the moment, which is in its third draft. And I did work on one with Tom a while ago, a few years ago now. But the nature of the business in Hollywood is very much about they know who they know, and they know who and it's very much about relationship and track record and personal trust. And movie people don't trust novelists. They just because we are not the same. We as I say, we don't think about story in the same way. We don't use the same structural models and move. I shouldn't say this, but a lot of the movie people I know do not understand books. They don't read them, and they don't really get them.
Just trying
you
to
know.
sell tickets, right? Sell streams and
So, I
sell
mean,
seats.
and that doesn't mean that I don't think that they're artists or creatives or anything like, but they have a very particular way of telling stories. And the first job when getting a book or a novelist to work in with film is to then force the story to turn into something else, which I totally get. You kind of have to, but for the most part, the novelist is not the person they're going to trust to do that. They're going to want to go, especially if you're dealing with big studios, they're going to go to the people who they have worked with before, because that's how the industry works. It's all about personal relationships and connections.
Yeah.
So, I have
Politics out
always
there.
been a movie fan. From a kid, I've always been a movie fan. I've always been interested in developing in film and TV. But, I'm a word guy primarily. So, we'll see.
Yeah. All right. So how do you kind of like, especially something like Secret Machines, how do you balance the disclosure content with the storyline? I know, like with Monsters of California, it can sometimes feel like too obvious that they're pushing something specific to a disclosure piece without kind of doing justice to the storyline. I imagine that's very hard to do as a writer as well. And then the second thing is also like the added pressure to make sure it's accurate research, because that the people who are absorbing that content are probably pretty well versed in the subject matter too. Is that kind of like a also added pressure as a writer to make sure you don't kind of get it wrong from that perspective?
Yeah, yeah. I think that the question of what it is to get something wrong is a tricky one, particularly in this kind of area where there's a lot of disagreement about what is right and what is wrong. It's not like, if I was writing a movie about Shakespeare, a biographical movie, I can't imagine anything worse. But if I was writing it, I would have pretty strong ideas about what I thought was right and what I thought was wrong. I have a lot fewer of those ideas when it comes to dealing with this kind of material. And it's partly why I rely on Tom and his people to say, here's what we want to, and occasionally I'll say, a novel can raise all kinds of possibilities. If it's going to come down in one place, I need you to tell me what you want that place to be. Because if there's one idea that you want to emerge absolutely clearly, then I need to know what that is. But part of the richness of fiction, of course, is that you can float multiple possibilities without necessarily committing to it. Or, especially with a series, you can raise a possibility and then you can change your mind based on new data or whatever. And it turns out that something that we thought was true in book 1 turns out not to be true in book 3 or whatever, But again, this comes also down to what I was saying before about collaborators having different strengths. And my focus always is going to be on the internal cohesion and interest of the story as story. And so I'm working with people who are saying, we want to sort of address this kind of issue or this idea. And I'm going to be always like, fine, but my primary investment is in telling a good story and making it work on a character level. So that sort of, I was going to say tension, but in some ways balance is maybe a better metaphor. And, if Tom comes and says, here's the thing, here's the idea that I really want to present, then obviously that I'm going to work that in, but I'm going to make it part of a story that works as a story. So I would say, hopefully the books do work as books, hopefully all of them, including Trinity. But I think if they do, in part, it's because the quote unquote truth that is being presented is always kind of subtextual. It's always, it's like, if the purpose of a novel is to say, here is the truth, clear and unvarnished, here's the idea. Then it's not a novel.
Yeah.
Then make a
Textbook.
documentary or
Yeah.
write a nonfiction book and just say it. If that's your sole purpose, then that's what you should do, right?
Yeah. Good point.
And that is not my area of focus.
Sure. Yeah. So I noticed in his Tom's forward for Secret Machine, he wrote that forward for it. He describes you as an open-minded skeptic. I also read that you spent some time in your younger years exploring priesthood. So that raises a question: how have you, if at all, processed how what you To the Stars are doing? To kind of help break down the barriers between science and religion, and so now we're like the Pope is even saying, you know, yeah, there's probably something out there. We can't really say no anymore. Do you look at that as that much of a macro spectrum to say we're doing things that are altering the way like these worldwide entities are thinking about other life forms?
I mean, I don't think of it as being this is something we're doing, or certainly I don't think of it as something I'm doing. I think we're part of a larger conversation, that is global, and I think in many ways the Catholic Church has always been more pro-science than people realize. At least the relatively modern Catholic Church has no problem, for example, with evolution and things like that, in ways that a lot of Christian churches some Christian churches continue to struggle with. But so it doesn't surprise me that the Pope, has made those kind of remarks. It's not something that I am sort of actively engaged in or think about. But I do think that I was interviewed a little while ago on a podcast on one of the sort of UFO podcast things, in which people said, "Oh, well, these books have been instrumental in raising the level of the conversation, or making the conversation more visible in this country." And some people have said, "Oh, it's part of the thing that led to the congressional hearings and stuff." I don't think of them in those terms. I don't even really know that that's true. I suppose it's a part of these books are contributing factors in a larger zeitgeist, in a larger sort of cultural shift, or a movement away from the idea that anybody who talks about UFOs must be lunatic, which was a sort of popular position for a very, very long time. And so I think, if we're contributing to that, then that's good. And if we're contributing in an open-minded and skeptical fashion to that discussion, then that is also good. And if that means, disclosure of good information so that we can look at it and say, what do we think is real? What is going on here? And be able to be genuinely open-minded and genuinely critical, pro and con, and look at details and say, this is good evidence, this is not good evidence. Here's reason why maybe, some of the official sources debunking this stuff are right. Here's reasons why they're not right,
Yeah.
I'd like us to be able to get to a place where I like the idea of being open-minded and skeptical at the same time, and being able to sort of scrutinize stuff instead of coming in with an agenda and saying, well, I'm clearly on this side, therefore I'm predisposed to believe all this and not believe this. You know what I mean? Because that doesn't seem to really help. It means that we're sort of stuck in, as with everything else in this bloody country, we're sort of stuck in this eternally polarized discourse where there's almost no actual conversation taking place because we're all trapped in our various echo chambers.
Yeah, if you're too blind to the agenda to even consider other facts, then you're in trouble, especially as someone who's maybe producing information for others to absorb. I think that's definitely true. And like I said, this country is a little heavy on that right now, news sources and all that. So I think you So with this pretty straightforward question, do we have an ending to Secret Machines? You don't have to say what it is, but is there an ending to that
You mean
series? Or
is the book already written,
no,
or
like,
or do we know how it
continuing
ends?
Tom, do you have an ending, and is that like just predicated on the format that you're going to release it on, or is that just not there yet?
We are not there yet. No, I mean, for various reasons, that project has been sort of put on hiatus. It's not dead by any means. People, every other day I get a message from somebody saying, "When's Secret Machines coming out?" Or people saying, "I hear it's already been written, but yeah, why aren't you publishing it?" I'm like, "It's not been written." I don't know where people get this information, but no, it has not been written. And there's a lot going on, and some of it is scheduling stuff and Tom's busyness and my busyness, but there are other factors involved. I think I don't even know all of them. When we're ready, Tom will talk to me more about it when we're ready to proceed. The TV stuff is a factor. I know it is, in terms of shaping, but also I think the nature of those sort of the ongoing controversy over the various hearings and the response to it and the disclosure stuff. And I think that one of the issues is this is a trilogy. We said that from the outset. It was contracted as a trilogy. And before I was saying, you can float an idea in book 1 and then take it back. Or change it, modify it in book 3. You can't do that in book 3.
Yeah.
In book 3, you got to know exactly what you think. You got to know where we are and what we believe and what the sort of final position of the series is, whether you think of that as a true thing or as a fictional construct, which is just sort of adhering to its own narrative cohesion, But there's a point at which you got to say, the end. That's the thing. And I think one of the concerns that has delayed the series is that there's a certain amount of we're not sure yet.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
And so long as certain things are still in flux, that could affect the point at which we say, "Here's our final position."
Yeah. Well, I'll take it as a compliment that people are so eager to hear how it ends. So if no one cares, you'd probably be like, "Well,
I hope
guess
so. I
no."
mean, some people are simply, as I said before, some people want to know how the story ends as a story, and they're interested in the characters and so on.
Yeah.
And some people just want the answer, and I can't help you with that.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, we'll end on this. So you recently wrote on your Facebook page that being a writer is often a tough, lonely business, and it's easy to feel like no one values what you do. Given that, do you have any advice for new or struggling writers out there that are maybe feeling that way? I also saw that you wrote like 8 novels over 20 years or something like that before you even got published. I know you've had a lot of advice on your Instagram and all that, but like, what would you say to other writers out there now who are just not breaking through?
I mean, the thing is, of course, the industry has changed completely. When I wrote those 8 novels and couldn't get published, nobody would do that now because they would publish them themselves, And in those days, because this was over 20 years ago, there was no self-publishing industry. There was vanity press, which means that you pay somebody to print your book and then they sit in your garage for the rest of your life, and was considered a sort of sign of failure. And there's a reason they were called vanity presses, right? But, for me, in retrospect, that first 20 years of my writing career was apprenticeship, was me learning the craft and learning. Now, of course, I can look at it that way because then I got published and I've subsequently done whatever it is, 26 novels and things like that. But that would be a lot harder to do if I couldn't think of it in those terms if I hadn't then been published. But as I say, you wouldn't do that now,
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense.
My dog is being quieted today.
Sorry.
Okay. So, I mean, if you're a young or new writer when you say trying to break out, I mean, I think part of the question always is setting the parameters of your own success. That self-publishing is a comparatively easy, comparatively cheap option. For most people, it's not an option that finishes up making. Most people don't break out, period, in any form. But if you have work that is done and that you're happy with, that you're proud of, and you can share it in some form and get people interested in it, that is always going to work for you. My relationship with Tom, I said, before that I feel very lucky, I feel very fortunate, and I have these things that, may turn into TV and movies and blah, 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 some of which have come from working with Tom. But Tom's interest in me initially was about books that I had published before, books that I had stopped thinking about. They come out, they sell for a while, and then people stop paying attention to them. So, you never know when the thing that you published is going to have some sort of payoff. And it could be decades later. I mean, if Secret Machines gets made, and we're optimistic that it is, but it has to get fully financed and all the rest of it, it'll have been 10 years since that book came out. And it's something that I had sort of stopped thinking about as a real possibility a long time ago. I have Steeplejack series that is currently in development. If that comes out, likewise, it will have been a decade since I wrote those books, So it's weird because you just never know. But I mean, what I would say to writers is keep doing it, figure out what it is that you like and do that a lot. Figure out the kind of stories that you're good at, or the kind of stories that you're interested in, the kind of stories you want to read, and get good at your craft. Learn the ropes, read everything, and write as much as you realistically can. And, I still think that there is enough life in the traditional publishing industry that I would say, maybe submit things to agents and editors and see if you get anywhere. But if you don't, then self-publishing might be a very real option. And as I say, I know plenty of people who make a very good living self-publishing. You just the difficulty with it is that you have to be your own marketer as well as your own writer. You've got to find, and there's so much stuff out there, millions and millions of books. So the difficulty becomes, first is writing the book. The next difficulty is getting seen, getting noticed. And that's in some ways harder because you can't control it.
Yes, well, that's great advice for everyone out there, whether I guess writing or whatever you're trying to do, really. So, yeah, I really appreciate this, AJ. Thank you so much for joining.
Sure.
I always tell people, you were like my first actual interview when I started doing the To the Stars page, however many years ago, and you've always been super accessible to the fans and answer a lot of questions. And we know it's trying not to like you too much, so. Definitely appreciate this, and for everyone watching, definitely go check out Trinity, coming out June 11th. It's not like there's some pre-orders right now, some signed copies that you could have pre-ordered, and I'm sure we'll see more to come. If you follow AJ's social media, you'll see probably a lot about that and where to get that. So thank you so much again for joining, and we really appreciate it. Great talk.
Thanks, we appreciate it.
All right, thanks, AJ.
Bye.